Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Table, a place where we tell stories about the games that we love. And a game that I love and has been very close to my heart for a very long time is a game called Adventure Conqueror King. If you're a fan of iconic productions, you will know that one of my first blog posts ever was a detailed review of ACKS, the Player's Companion, and Domains at War. And one of my very first podcast interviews back in the day was with Alexander Macris. Alexander, thank you for joining us on this new show on Iconic Production. And with me as another special guest is Richard Rowland of uh, his own internet fame. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here. Thank you for having
Yeah,
me on.
I'm very excited about this conversation. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So, if you don't know, Richard and I do a show called The Grand Campaign. Hopefully, we'll get back to that next year. We've still got more. The Grand Campaign goes ever onward. But today, we're here to talk about Adventure Conquer King, specifically Adventure Conquer King Second Edition, which is on Kickstarter now and is just blowing up like gangbusters. You're getting close to the 300,000 mark. So, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let's start with this. What for people in the chat and who are watching on the internet who don't know what Adventure Conquer King is or why there would be a second edition, give us a little history on that. Tell us about your impetus for making it and your impetus for updating it.
Sure. All right. So, well, Adventure Conqueror King System Imperial Imprint, or ACKS 2, is what's currently being kickstarted. It is the second edition of the original ACKS. I created the original ACKS back in 2011, kickstarted it in 2012, and it emerged out of a BX campaign that I ran from around 2008 to 2011. And I had this idea when I started the campaign that I wanted to do a game that would have really sweeping scope of combat and conquest. So I created this concept of like an empire that was about to fall and wrote up a bunch of mass combat rules. And so as we played out that campaign, the players weren't just adventurers doing fetch quests for increasingly powerful people. They were the powerful people for whom others fetch. And that then became the basis for that Kickstarter. ACKS 2 emerged initially with the thought I would just kind of reconsolidate about 12 years worth of supplements and source books. And then Wizards of the Coast, in an act of perfidious treachery, deauthorized the open game license. And now they've recanted, but fool me once, shame on you. Shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Mm-hmm. I don't trust them anymore. I don't think that was ethical behavior, and I'm not interested in having my business based on their license anymore. So I pulled ACKS off of the open game license, and that ended up being, a fair amount of work. And I took the opportunity, since I was having to do that anyway, to expand and improve the game.
Well, and I've been reading through. I'm a backer of your Patreon, and so this is one of the most. So Richard and I are firm believers in playtesting and blind playtesting, and that's the way you get a good game.
Yeah.
Your playtest document is now into the hundreds of versions.
Yeah.
Of it. What's the current version? Do you know that off the top of your head? It's like 111 or 121 the last time I looked.
Yeah, the last public release was 121. The current draft is 123.
Oh my gosh.
No, it's been. I'm a firm believer in incremental design and constant play testing and iteration. And so, Ascendant was my previous most play tested game, and we were at, I think, version 50. The original ACKS came out at version 42. So this one is been even more play tested.
Yeah, I think Jackals ended up in the 20s or 30s. So first of all, I was saying this before the show, for those of you who don't know, Jackals started off as a ACKS campaign that then, because of reading a book that we're going to talk about later, developed into its own system. So I owe a lot of design foundational, inspiration directly to you. So thank you. Jackals came together, but I had blind play testers up until the final moment sending me data. And I remember my wife and I having a long conversation about everyone, this last playtest group hated one mechanic, and I didn't want to change it, but they brought up a lot of good points about it, and it's actually now why the difficulty steps are in the game. There was no difficulty steps in the game beforehand, and it turns out to be something people really enjoyed. So thanks to those guys. I hope you got your free copies. I sent your name to Osprey, but that's all I got.
Even when I'm not running ACKS, I use it for developing demographics and also things like, I mean, John Matthew and I met for coffee like yesterday or Friday. It was Friday. And like you came in and I was there early and I was already working on something, but I had Sinister Stone of Saqqara just like next to me while I was working because I was working on a fort. And I was just like, I needed to remember certain little details. And it's so, that particular module, which I really love, is my favorite introductory module for really anything.
Yeah.
It's so detailed when it comes to things like, well, how many troops was this fort intended to support and things like that. And so it's like, well, rather than invent the wheel, I'm just going to shamelessly rip Alexander off. So
that adventure literally just got dinged to a 3-star review by Prince of Nothing because it was too detailed. And he was like, why do we care this much about the fort? And
I feel like anyone whose name is Prince of Nothing dinging something for it being too detailed is ridiculous. Like,
well,
I love that kind of stuff. And to me, it's the that's the stuff that gives the world texture and
right.
And then, I mean, here's the thing, like if you're the kind of judge who didn't want to use that kind of stuff anyway, then you're probably not running ACKS.
Right.
But then also like you can always just flip past that page, ignore it. But it becomes suddenly important if your players ever decide that they want to set up shop there.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the people in chat said, I read that review and even his example did not convince me at this point. Which, by the way, if you have questions for Alexander, put them in the chat. We'll get to them.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to Prince about it because, he's reviewed 3 of my products and every time it's been 3 stars. And what I realized is that the things I love about my products are the things he dings me for. So we're just, it is what it is. Some people prefer more minimalism and strict mechanical focus, whereas I am really into providing a textured world.
Well, and you can't. Not every game has to be made for everybody, and in fact, if you try and make a game for everybody, you end up with sort of just a not great game. I had somebody, the first negative review on Jackals, which is a Bronze Age fantasy role-playing game, was that I did not include, or specifically about the Levant, it did not include medieval Kabbalah monsters or Bronze Age China. I was like, well, not the game I was writing.
Right. What can you do?
So let's talk about ACKS 2, because one of the things I really love are the changes that you've made. Right, because original ACKS, as you said, cleaved kind of closely to BX, but really wasn't an OSR game because you had proficiencies and you had a detailed economic and domain management system, unlike anything that existed in 1E, BX, 2nd edition, like battle system only scaled, was it 1 to 10? Yeah. Whereas Domains of War, I went back and looked at it and looked at some of the previous stuff I had written about it. And one of the things I loved about Domains of War was you gave sort of a lens, like a telescopic lens to DMs to say, well, what level do you want to like adjudicate this at? Do you want to like resolve this in a couple of die rolls, but still have all the math back up so it feels satisfying? Do you want to do this on a map, or do you want to set up, a massive table with all of our, push lead, for example, and move this around? So what would you say are like the main things that you have changed? Partially because you had to rip out the OGL, so you're no longer, bound by what people were expecting to kind of make ACKS 2 its own. To make your own system out of it.
Right. Well, the The immediate change was I had to go through and find out which terms were from, the open game license, and make sure I didn't use anything that would be a violation of that. So that involved changing a lot of spell names, changing a lot of magic item names. In the process of doing that, I used it as an opportunity to revisit them and, kill a few sacred cows that were D&D isms that didn't necessarily make sense if you weren't trying to be a D&D game. I rebuilt a bunch of the monsters to get back closer to the mythic sources. So, for instance, ACKS is set in by default in late antiquity, and so our Gorgons are the Gorgons of late antiquity, which are winged, tusked women who turn you to stone. They're not bulls with metal scales, which was a medieval bestiary. Okay, so that's like a simple example of a change. More robustly, we revised all the rules for thieves to make them more awesome. Expanded a bunch of rules for dungeon delving, and really expanded the rules for wilderness exploration. And so now there's surviving the wild, weather in the wild, navigating the wild, finding layers. It's much more robust. So you could actually probably run a really satisfying ACKS campaign, almost as like a wilderness survival game at this point if you wanted to. So
I did just a little aside on that. I did something like that where I ran a daily game of D&D on Discord, mainly using ACKS, and but of course, when I explain it to people, I just said we played D&D every day for 100 days.
Yeah.
But it was called the Procedural Wasteland, and I just started with a giant, completely like a randomly populated hex map with basically a state of complete a terra incognita. So I don't know what's on the map, and the players don't know what's on the map.
That's cool.
And then I used ACKS to generate ACKS, and then also the D30 sandbox tool, toolkit. I use that to basically generate the content of each hex as we got to it. And then when we found out, there's a village here, then I'd go to ACKS and figure out, well, how many people live in the village, and how many people of what various classes live in the village, and things like that. But basically just use it to kind of procedurally generate the world as we went, and it was an absolute blast. We had a tremendously fun time, and I mean, it's not the way that you would always want to run it, but it was a blast, and it took, it was basically what was necessary to play every day for 100 days. Like, it had to be literally zero prep.
Yeah.
How long were the sessions?
Well, we played on Discord, and it was play by post, so we just did it just kind of all day, every day for 100 days. And it was, eventually I had to stop doing it so I could write my own game, but it was a ton of fun. I would like to do something like that, maybe live, and do 1 hour sessions a day, over lunches, and do that for a prolonged period of time. I think that would be actually a pretty neat kind of an experience. So
we did lunchtime D&D at the Escapist, and it was pretty fun. Have you ever played speed chess, where you have to make the decisions really quickly, and so when you're playing speed chess, you often make mistakes you would never make in a normal chess game? Same thing is true apparently of 1 hour D&D games at lunch, because wow, were people getting party wiped all over the place. So it was very good. It was very good, yeah.
So we had a quick question in chat. So for the Arn Empire maps, are there plans to expand the world map, and are there plans to release a big map for purchase?
I don't think I will expand it beyond the current size, because I haven't even really tapped the setting as a whole yet. I do think it would be fun to do an Arn Empire campaign setting book, and to have a huge map that you could purchase, and you could use for strategic warfare and things like that. I'm also been on the side. I've been dabbling on a project called the Great Skysos War, which is a huge mass combat simulating the Arn Empire's battle against the invading Skysos hordes in the west. I thought that might be interesting. I was thinking about doing that as like a huge distributed play game, but I got caught up with ACKS 2, so it got backburnered.
That's fair. Yeah.
But I definitely am going to explore the Arn Empire world more. I'm going to make that map available at some point in some really cool way. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that. Even if you go, I know you had mentioned that one route you're looking at either doing like the Arn Empire book, or just you have Buy This ACKS, and then there will be the Elf book that kind of details this, that region and cultures and kind of doing it that way.
Yep.
I'm totally fine either way. Haro's
I
Smiley
I
said a
need to.
giant map would be amazing.
Yeah, I need to do an elf book. There's a lot of demand for it. So I'm stuck on the title. So I can't move forward until I have a title as good as By This Axe.
That's
So yeah. My current working title is With Sneering Condescension.
ooh, I like it.
I was gonna say, I feel my people are very underrepresented currently in products from uh yeah, I would really love an elf book that was made with the same level of detail and love and humor actually that you find in By This
Oh,
Axe.
By This Axe is fantastic. I'm going to put links to everything in the show notes when it goes live on YouTube, but just know all of these things that we're talking about, you'll be able to find them.
It's another 3-star review because it was too detailed.
I
I can't win, man.
So I have friends who love playing Thieves, and Thieves have always been sort of the red-headed stepchild of early
sure.
D&D because either people were like, well, they weren't in the original, so I don't want Thieves in here, or you know, even second edition, we have several Thieves in my, because I'm running multiple 2E campaigns right now, all set in the same world, and I have a lot of Thieves, but there are some challenges with playing a thief in an old school game.
For sure.
Several of them being the one and done for locks and things per level. If you fail your, open locks, gain a level, or you never get to open it. Or the fact that, I think you mentioned this in another interview, that most, some tables are like, well, we could have a thief, or we could have a wizard and a cleric who do everything the thief does with 100% chance of success.
Yep.
How did you address this in Acts 2?
But it took a lot of work, but I'm really happy with how it came out. I had done 2 prior articles in Axioms attempting to improve Thieves in different ways, and hadn't quite gotten there. But I think the Acts 2 version did solve it. So the first thing was to address the one and done. Is I split those actions into hasty and methodical. So let's take a thief who has it's called a lock picking throw of 18 plus. Okay, so that's his hasty throw. He can do that in 1 round and make the check, and he has a 15% chance to succeed, just like a typical thief does in all the OSR games at first level. However, he can do a methodical search and get a +4 bonus. So now he succeeds on 14 plus, which is a huge increase in his percentage chance. And also, if you fail a methodical search, as long as you don't roll a 1 and botch, you can try again. And so now you have this, you have a situation where a high level thief, like if I'm a 14th level thief, my hasty throw is 4 plus. So a high level thief can just move through the dungeon at a hasty rate and nothing stops him.
Mm-hmm.
And then a low level thief, you just have this choice of trade-off of how much time do we want to invest into getting through this lock door. So that works really well. Then I removed a bunch of the spells that wizards and clerics use to make thieves irrelevant. So there's no more find trap spell. There's not a knock spell. What there is a battering ram spell. So you can blow the door open, right? But what you can't do is pick a lock magically.
Nice.
Another major problem that thieves had is that one of their key powers was hiding in shadows, but they couldn't see in the dark and everybody else could. So it was kind of like being a medieval ninja, but you're up against the U.S. Army with thermal goggles, and you're like, why are my ninja tactics not working? They're like, well, because you're glowing infrared, bro. So we got rid of a lot of the infravision type powers on the demi-human races. We ruled that lightless vision counts, which is our equivalent of infravision, counts as dim light. So a thief can always hide from lightless vision if he always counts as being in dim light against it. And then finally, we gave the thieves shadowy senses so that they have a chance to be able to see in the dark. And it represents like human echolocation, Helen Keller, field of vibration in the wall stuff, good night vision, good hearing, etc. Yeah.
So sort of leading into the OSR, I remember like the way I've explained OSR versus modern D&D is in modern D&D, you start off as, the hero and you end up as Superman. And in the OSR, you sort of start as like a regular guy and end up as, you know, Batman or King Batman, as it may be in Adventurer Conqueror
Yes,
King.
yes. You end up as King Batman.
As King
Yes,
Batman, which
yes.
is now the comic
Yeah.
I want DC to write.
Which is the only thing I've ever wanted to be, honestly.
So
Yeah.
thieves end up being a little bit more Daredevil-ish in the fact that
Yes.
they have the ability to operate in the environment they were designed to operate in.
Correct, correct. And then we also expanded the rules for the high level thief game, where you we expanded the rules for the high level thief game where one sec, guys.
No.
Sorry,
worries.
my wife had to step out the house. So
No worries.
Goodbye. Okay, so we expanded the rule for the high level thief game to create this sort of full-fledged rules for criminal syndicates and spy networks. And so you can take over enemy guilds and hire their people, but then have coups against you. You know, you can send people out to do slander, assassination, smuggling, and all of the rules integrate with the rules of the rest of the systems. So, for instance, your player, your friend Bob sets up a domain with a Senate and appoints an NPC to the Senate. Well, that NPC ends up failing a loyalty roll. Now he's a problem. He's on the Senate seat. Well, no problem. Your thief player, who's the Grandmaster of Crime, arranges for the senator to be assassinated. Like, you know, it's all good fun. So
So currently I'm prepping for a Jackals game where I'm going to start towards the end of the Aeneid, where those who have fled from Troy have landed on this new area, and I'm going to be like,
right.
Here's the 1,000 names on the ship. See if you can build something before the names run out. And my goal is,
wow, that's awesome,
to use that as the basis for an ACKS campaign set, you know, 1,000 years later when whatever they've built has collapsed. So, you know, I'm thinking 7 or 8 years from now, you know, just...
Yep.
But
that's awesome.
So I'd like to ask, I'm going to hit a couple of the chat questions, and then we'll go into kind of the next thing on the list. We had somebody who said, if people wanted to do third-party modules for ACKS 2, is there a template to follow? It's a good question.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, the template I would recommend you follow is the one I used in Secrets of the Nether City, where we have box text, you know, then subtitled, you know, trap, monster, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm happy to provide that to anyone who's interested. I would love to see third-party support. There's going to be a free compatibility license. So
awesome.
Yeah.
And then John Doom was like, he's often wanted to run this 1 hour at lunch RPG session. If you had any pitfalls to avoid or any advice to give somebody who's doing a 1 hour, you know, at lunch gaming session, what would you recommend to them?
Well, don't expect to level up very much. Yeah, it's a really kind of a very different way of playing. I would say it helps to have a team with a clear leader that everyone trusts to make some of the mundane decisions, because otherwise you can lose, you know, I've seen groups lose 15, 20 minutes just arguing about marching order or something like that. And that's just death in a 1 hour campaign.
Yeah.
So you gotta have people that I think know each other well enough that they're going to, you know, quickly cooperate and come to decisions. And then I think you just have to change the emphasis on what you cover and what you don't cover. Like anything that's, you know, it might be fun to role play the interaction with the merchant as you buy the sword, but in a 1 hour game, you don't do that. You're like, all right, you bought the sword, mark it on, go.
Yeah.
Because you just, you know, the time is a luxury you don't have. So
cool. So this has been this was my number one GM reference tool, the first edition D&D Dungeon Master's Guide. I love that Gary went through and actually took the time to try and teach someone how to be a dungeon master. Everything from here's why probability works to my favorite chapter, which is here's the kind of crap your players are going to try and use spells for, and don't let them do it, like spell by spell, which is brilliant. But it's hard to get a hold of. And so a couple of years ago, I remember when you had put this out on Kindle, and then there were print versions of Arbiter of Worlds, which is the book I've been recommending since then as the number one book to, hey, if you want to learn how to be a dungeon master in a very specific genre, right? Go ahead and pick this up. And everybody I've recommended it to has loved it.
I mean, the advice in the book is not even really genre specific. Like you can take it and apply it to any kind of a game. Actually,
but you have to have a specific style of game you enjoy running.
Well,
Right.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not genre specific, but it's certainly like, stylistically.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I taught a class for Signum University on it was called the complete spelled with an A, the Complete Game Master, and I basically made a 6-week curriculum based around Arbiter of Worlds.
Wow.
And then we had for the assignments, we had, okay, we talked about how to, we've just read the chapter and discussed the chapter on like how to do your, like your summary of your history, your, how to place layers, things like this. And so now you go do it. And
Wow.
those were the assignments. And there were several people who, had like somebody had like an alternate Quaker settling Pennsylvania setting that she was doing, and she was able to like use all the same kind of all basically use all of those guidelines to make this alternate early Americas role-playing setting, which was really cool. So it's not really genre specific. It's certainly style, specific to a certain kind of a style. Not even a style that I think, you were using the word OSR a minute ago, John Matthew, and I don't know. I've kind of started to feel like OSR doesn't tell me very much anymore.
No,
right? Because
it does. It's very
it's
quickly
so,
been watered down.
because
Yeah.
there's a lot of people who are doing OSR things, and but what they're trying to make is, here's a complete game that fits on 12 pages, and you'll probably only ever play it one time.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which is fine if that's what you're in it for, but for me that's significantly less interesting than something I could get 7 or 8 years to play out of.
Exactly.
Yeah, agreed. So, well, I've integrated a lot of Arbiter of Worlds into the new Judges Journal.
Yes.
My goal was to make something that was a worthy successor to the AD&D DMG, because that was, as a young man, as a teenager, that was my Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I read every word. My vocabulary increased 100% on the basis of that book alone, although I didn't know how to pronounce any of the words and still don't. And it's just an epic tome. What's interesting about the first edition DMG is that Gary was able to take for granted that a lot of the people that read his book knew about war games,
Mm-hmm.
and they knew how to run war games, and they had done war game campaigns. And so he had to really focus on a lot of things related to role playing that today seem obvious to us. And so he didn't talk a lot about the war game side of things, which then I think resulted a generation later, when people didn't have that war game knowledge and then they read the DMG, it feels like it's incomplete, or they just entirely miss the existence of the war game aspect of Dungeons and Dragons entirely. So, the approach I've taken in the Judges Journal is similar to Gary. I'm trying to focus on the knowledge base of the players I'm going to have, and tell them what they need to know, given where we are today in gamer culture, what they need to know to run ACKS 2. So like a lot of things, like how do you actually set up a campaign world so that your players will want to be conquerors, right? Because if you set up like a really utopian setting with a just king, and and he's sending you out on quests, like, you're never going to be a conqueror. You'll feel like a shitty person.
That's right.
And very few contemporary players, sort of are Genghis Khan like in their mentality of they should just conquer for the sake of conquering, right? So how do you overcome that? Anyway, I really hope that people consider it as much of a treasure as the DMG. It's like, if you buy only one book on game mastering, buy the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. But if you buy 2 books,
buy the judge. So I love what you have done with the Judges Journal, and I mean, to echo Richard, I'm using it to set up my Jackals campaign, the Aeneid one that's coming up.
Right.
So if you look over the history of Dungeons and Dragons, I really think only the 1E D&G attempted to teach you how to be a dungeon master. Like, I love 2nd edition. I think it's the last edition that actually, I mean, if you like, I read through the 2nd edition player's handbook a lot for my game prep, and it's like, hey, play a fighter if you want to be Hiawatha or Gilgamesh, and all of these real world examples. And the DMG really is chapter by chapter, same as the player's handbook. Here's the DM side of the rules. And then we hit third edition, and the whole game becomes self-referential on purpose.
Right.
Like if you go back and read, Jonathan Tweet's comments or Monty Cook's comments, the goal was to make D&D self-referential and cut the ties, which I think was a mistake, to real-world history because, again, Appendix N was so heavily influenced by
Right.
people who understood real-world history. But why do you think, and I won't even get into the later editions because I think they just continue the trend of second and third edition. Why do you think people kind of left this idea of, hey, the Dungeon Master's Guide should help you learn to be a better dungeon master and not just contain the tables that you need to randomly roll stuff?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a couple reasons. First, I think that for a while at least, when D&D was at the height of its popularity, there was an assumption that the way you were going to learn to play D&D was by playing D&D with people who introduced you.
An oral
And the way you
tradition.
were and the way you were going to learn to game master was by, seeing someone else do it and then being taught. And so, second, I think there was a thought within Wizards of the Coast, or TSR rather at the time, within TSR, that the BX or BECMI books were supposed to be the teaching tools, and the AD&D players were the more highbrow types who didn't need that sort of thing. And then third, I wonder if there wasn't, just as part of like changing cultural mores, I think probably someone like Gary Gygax writing in the early 80s was probably a lot more confident saying, this is what you are supposed to do. Whereas by the time you get to the early 90s and the mid 90s, there's a lot more like, everything is good and there's so many ways we can do everything. And it's just like a different attitude. So, yeah, I definitely am more like Gary Gygax. I'm like, this is the way.
Well, to a degree, right? But I think you and Gary also share something in the fact that each campaign is a law unto itself, which is the Autark, company motto.
Yeah.
And the fact that, hey, here is the baseline. And once you understand the baseline, go off and do what you want with it. I watched an interview you recently did where you said part of the problem you have, not problem, part of the issue you have parsing playtests or feedback from people is the fact that most GMs have heavily house ruled things. So when they're like, this is broken, you have to like, okay, well, tell me all of your house rules so I can see what possibly.
Yeah. It's been interesting to discover. And I think that kind of mechanical, mashing up is fun. I do it myself. I mashed up ACKS proficiencies with Mecton. Right.
Yeah.
Like good times.
RuneQuest and Cyberpunk was my favorite chapter in Arbiter of Worlds.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think that's good and healthy, but it definitely makes it more difficult to get, feedback. Like, I had someone tell me that the Thracian gladiator was overpowered. And I was like, oh, you aren't finding his inability to use weapons and his slow movement rate kind of balances out. He's like, well, I didn't want the Thracian gladiators to be left behind in combat. So I buffed their movement rate to full speed and I let them use weapons in their claws. And I'm like, okay, well, this is why they're overpowered.
I had someone who reached out to me about Jackal was like, hey, I don't like the way monster attacks work, so I inverted all of the attacks tables so that their powerful attacks go off when they roll higher, and their weaker attacks go off when lower. When lower for their more powerful attacks and higher triggers their least powerful attacks. I'm like, I don't think that's a good idea. Have you play tested this? No, but it'll be fine. And like 3 months later, he's like, that was the worst mistake I've ever made.
Oh,
I was like, yeah, the system's kind of designed to work in a specific way, and at least try it before you change it. That was you. He's actually in the chat.
Oh no.
We've been chatting about it, and it's been great, and it wasn't great, and it was good to hear that feedback because I was like, oh well, maybe I should think about looking at it going forward, changing it up, and then he was like, no, don't do that. This was
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for, the concept of Chesterton's fence as applied to game design, right? Like, don't change a rule until you understand why that rule is there. And, because the smallest change, a seemingly trivial change can have enormous consequences. You know, we were just joking about one of the ones in the ACKS Chat of Kings where I had initially had that you know, backpacks and sacks were 0 encumbrance, right? Because you're just using them to carry other items, so they shouldn't count as encumbrance themselves. And so, you know, yeah, of course, I have one player, Eric, who is the master of cheese, and so, you know, they were in some situation where they needed to build fortifications, and he's like, oh well, no problem, because I've got 1,000 sacks, so we could just fill them with sand and build this fortification. And I'm like, how are you carrying 1,000 sacks? He's like, well, they have no encumbrance. And I'm like, well,
Oh
where are
boy.
you storing them?
Boy.
And he says, in his belt pouch. I was like, okay, I brought this on myself.
I mean, but
That was on
also,
me.
you have the rule in ACKS. Again, when I remember reading it the first time, and I think my number one piece of advice when I did my initial review is do not skip over the gear section, which is often the most skipped over section in any role-playing
I
game.
remember that.
Because
yeah.
it's so important, right? Every 10 items, if they have no encumbrance, count as 1 stone. So I'm sorry, Eric, you have 100 stone worth of bags.
Yep.
All right. So in one of your other, if I can switch topics real quick, you said simulationism, which Richard and we have a very deep appreciation for simulation, both in the games we run and in the games we design. I don't
we're bringing it back, man. We're bringing it back.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think the only other game besides ACKS that I think is actually making a valiant stab at simulationism is the latest RuneQuest incarnation from Chaosium, because they're like, we don't care about how the rules, like, I won't say they don't care about how the rules, but their primary goal about the rules is it has to simulate something in the world of Glorantha.
Right.
So the rules reflect that. And a lot of people, you know, prefer to play 13th Age Glorantha or, Hero Quest, or now Quest Worlds, I guess, because the rules of RuneQuest, I mean, the fact that it takes, before you start, I don't know if you've looked at the latest edition, but
I haven't seen the latest edition. No, last edition I saw was the one back when they did Elric.
Oh yes. So my favorite part, they've always said RuneQuest is really about your community, right? Your clan is more important than your individual character. Who you are related to is more important than, so if this character dies, the family and the clan lives on. So the first thing you do in the latest edition of RuneQuest is you start with your grandparents and start rolling a history table that gives your character bonuses. And then you go through, so here's 10 years of history for my grandparents, here's 10 years of history for my parents, and now I can make my character because I now know who they are in relation to the community. And it takes like an hour to an hour and a half to get a table through those charts. But that's the stuff, like, that's the simulationism that we love. And you said it creates a form of noetic appreciation. So I'd like you to, if you don't mind, talk a bit about that, because Richard is helming a book that's coming out about recovering the sacred imagination. And I have an article in there about role-playing games as kind of ritual and liturgy and how they bring beauty to our lives.
Absolutely.
And this whole topic of noetic appreciation is kind of right in line with that. So if you don't mind, like, unpack that a bit for us.
Yeah, sure. So noetic appreciation, it comes from nous, which is the Greek word for the ability to apprehend truth directly. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans believed that there were essentially 2 faculties, nous and logos, as the Greeks called them, or intellectio and ratio, as they were called by the later Latin writers. The first was the ability to perceive truth, and then the second was the ability to reason from truths to further conclusions. By the time you roll into the Enlightenment, the concept of nous or intellectio has basically been disregarded. And so you get, someone like David Hume saying that, we have no basis to believe in causality. And, you have the statement of self-evident truths being like, well, self-evident to who, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of stumbled upon this concept while I was doing separate philosophical work. And I realized that it explained why I loved simulation so much, because I think the human mind is in fact tuned to want to try and find truth. And we could discuss why that is. I'm sure an evolutionist would have a different perspective than a theologist, but I believe that the human mind does want to have an apprehension of truth, and that there is a joy that comes when you experience art that feels true, right? And I call that noetic appreciation. And it's the opposite of suspension of disbelief. So, suspension of disbelief is when you have to ignore what you know to be true in order to enjoy a piece of art. And then noetic appreciation is when you use what you know to be true in order to better appreciate a work of art. So we see that like in a movie, like, Oliver Stone's Alexander is one I like to use the example of. People that are ancient historians who watch that just love it because of how much they put in to really match the world of Alexander, even down to like little trivial details. Like everybody made fun of the fact that the Macedonians were given Irish accents in that movie, but that was actually done on purpose because the Greeks were given English accents, and the rural Irish accent was to the upper class English accent as the Macedonian accent was to the Athenian accent. And so the fact that the Macedonians all sort of sounded like country boys compared to the Greeks was intentional. And it's this thing where, like, if you know these things, you enjoy it so much more. And I want my RPGs to have that. I want my role-playing games to give noetic appreciation to the players who participate in them.
Speaking of the movies, I remember talking with Richard about the Lord of the Rings trilogy and how much you loved all of the attention to detail, and then we hit Return of the King and Gondor has plate mail. You were like,
right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and there's a related to noetic appreciation is the concept of, secondary creation that Tolkien elaborates on. Where, I think for him it was almost a holy act because God is the creator, and so subcreation, is in a sense, taking on the likeness of God, becoming closer to God by engaging in this act. So I think for him it was very sacred. And there's this wonderful line where a letter where someone messages Tolkien, send him a piece of paper, which is how you used to email people, and he says, hey, what's the origin of this thing? And Tolkien's handwritten response is must find out, right? And it's like, it's not that he's going to make it up, but he has to find out what the true answer is in Middle Earth. And that belief in the secondary but real existence of Middle Earth is what makes those books so powerful. And that's what I try and tap into in my own world building and game design.
Yeah, something I've been trying to do. So for people who don't know, I've got a tabletop RPG using the same system as Jackals, or at least my own adaptation of it, called Emboria: Role-Playing in the World Under Starlight. It's coming out next year. And one of the things that is a major feature, I would say like almost like a dominant feature of the setting, is that the campaign book comes with a full liturgical calendar, and then at least 400 to 500 lines of hymnography for each feast.
Yeah.
And I was telling JM right before we started recording that I've been working on this, and a lot of these are hymns or things that I've been writing for the last 20 years. And but so I'm working on getting everything kind of edited and up to snuff for the book. And today is the first day that literally since I started drafting, this is the campaign books, this is the second of 2 books for the Kickstarter. Today is the first day that it occurred to me that I might need to actually include explanations of what these feasts are about, as opposed to just like the hymnography for the feast, because like to me it's so I've been working on it for so long and gone so deep into it that for me it's like I'm just describing a thing that actually happened, and I was there and I saw it, and
Yep.
And so so it just today it just occurred to me that giving this to somebody else, they would actually want to know, okay, well, exactly what is the Feast of Lenonome and what's it about, things like that. But one of the things that I'm intending to do is to make those explanations relatively terse. But then here's 500 lines of poetry. So if you want to really find out like what's the real substance of this. And this, I understand that this automatically, is going to mean a lot of people self-select out of wanting to play this particular game. But that's a little intentional, is that I'm really making this game for people who want to do that sort of non-ergodic, non-trivial work to kind of to go in and dig around, and instead of just like sort of like, here's another generic medieval campaign setting, but actually say, here's 500 lines of poetry on this feast, and by the way, there's a bunch of names and events and legends and myths and everything that that this poetry is built upon, which you as the game master are then really free and encouraged to use that as the basis for developing your own material. So this is how, for me, I really like the idea of you called it what, noetic what?
Noetic appreciation.
Noetic appreciation. I think most people who follow me online know that I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and so this, the idea of the nous and the intellect and the way they work together is actually really foundational to our spirituality, and so this game reflects a lot of that. It reflects a lot of that. I like, if I had to call it something, it would be like noetic wonder or something like that. But just the it should be I'm not gonna go beyond. I don't want to like talk up any game, let alone my own game, as being more than a game can be, right? It's still just a game, but going through this hymnography as you're building your campaign, and then as your players play through the game and discover it, that should be I'm not going to say a mystical experience, but maybe like a quasi-mystical experience. That should be, there should be if nothing else, it should be an apocalyptic experience, in the sense of something is being unveiled.
Absolutely.
So we had a question in chat. What interesting side note. I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, Richard. The whole reason the world is called Calypsis is because it is veiled. I
think first time we ever had a conversation about it.
We've been friends for a while, so we've had lots of conversations about world and game. So Tinker Hellraiser asked, would a noetic response to art be an intuitive understanding? I'm gonna feel that to you guys.
Whew, that's a great question. So I would say the current concept of philosophical intuition that you come upon is probably closest modern concept to the ancient belief in nous or intellectio. I mean, like Plato made an argument sometimes that actually we're remembering things that we already knew to be true. Others have gone a different route. So I do think it's intuitive, but it's not intuitive in the sense of, oh, I've got a hunch. It's intuitive in the sense that when someone says A is A, that A is A, and it's self-evident. So it's that. You
have to remember that the same people who kind of coined this terminology to talk about the human person were also people who were starving themselves so that they could commune with triangles, which is literally what Pythagoras was doing, or not Pythagoras, Euclid. This is literally what Euclid was doing, right?
And yet non-Euclidean things are associated with madness as opposed
to... Right, exactly, right, yeah. Well, it's because people take triangles for granted, when they're actually these amazing things. But there's in Eastern Orthodox spirituality, there's a common saying, something like, let your mind, that is your logos, descend into your heart, that is your nous. And the kind of what this means is something like things should be natural and unforced. Right, things become, let's say the experience of truth, the experience of knowing truth, the experience of communing with something that's beyond yourself becomes natural and unforced. So I'm not just trying to like really vividly imagine something, for instance, in prayer, which actually they say you should never do. I'm not trying to just like really vividly imagine something and psych myself up into a certain state. That's the opposite of the thing that we're trying to do. But instead, it should just be this sort of like, A is A, of course it is, right? Or this thing happened in a story, this thing happened in a myth. Well, of course it did. right? And that sort of ability to kind of move through truth or to move through a story in a way that's natural and unforced, and the truth reveals itself to you, that's what it means for something to be noetic.
Spinning off that, I actually had a conversation today where somebody was talking about King Arthur and how could we call Arthur history? And it made me think of Umberto Eco had a really great essay on truth. And he's like, right, Anna Karenina dies by throwing herself under the train. This is known. This is fact. This is history. If anyone tries to tell you otherwise, they're obviously either crazy or a liar. If we found out tomorrow that Hitler didn't die in the bunker, but actually fled to Argentina, we would actually have to rewrite the history, but we can never rewrite Anna Karenina's story. And so I was like arguing that Arthur is historical. Like Arthur's story is somehow even more real than the history that we have. Because again, we can find new pieces of history. People are debating things. It can rewrite itself. But Arthur is Arthur.
Right.
So, well, go ahead. Go ahead, Alexander.
It's just occurred to me that Reddit is now going to say that I support triangle-based anorexia.
You have had a rough time on Reddit.
Yeah. All right. But anyway.
All right. So let's talk about another term that you have been talking about that I think I'll let Richard, once I introduce it, if he has anything to add to that, I'll let him kind of narrate this next section. But I remember one of my earliest game books that I had was Palladium Fantasy. So Heroes Unlimited, Palladium Fantasy. I could make characters, had no clue that it was actually a game until I sat down for my first game of GURPS and went, oh, I have game books. And I still remember to this day, the thing that bugged me most about the Palladium Fantasy core rulebook is when they're explaining how the old gods went to, the younger races went to war with the old gods with magic so destructive it was like 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. And I remember realizing as a kid in middle school going, what the hell? Why was this an example in my fantasy book? Why did they drop an atomic bomb reference in the middle of this fantasy explanation? And so you've been talking about the diegetic nature of things in games. And I would love for you to by the way, I'm going to post all of the links. Alexander goes into great detail on his show, Arbiter of Worlds. You should go check out his channel. It's wonderful. But seeing as you're on my channel now, I'm going to ask you to expand on that.
Yeah, totally. Well, for those who aren't familiar with the term diegesis, the diegesis is the story world of a piece of art, and then diegetic means that it relates to that. The easiest way to understand it is movie soundtracks. If you hear like some cool 80s tune and the protagonist is wearing headphones, and then he takes the headphones off and the 80s tune goes away, that was diegetic music, right? The character was hearing it in the story world, and we were also hearing it. Whereas when Propellerhead plays, when Neo and Trinity attack the machine headquarters, they're not actually hearing Propellerhead. We're just getting to enjoy Propellerhead to their attack. That's non-diegetic. And I think the more you can be diegetic, the better. Not everyone agrees with me on that, but for instance, with By This Axe, I wrote all of the lore diegetically. Like the entire first half of the book is presented in character. It's from the viewpoint of the world. And even when I write game mechanics, I try to avoid being very non-diegetic. So for instance, nowhere do I say that the Skysos are actually just the Huns, right? Like, because who would the Huns be, right? You would never find that in campaign material about. I might throw it in like a little designer's note in an appendix or something, but I want the material that's presented to the players to make sense in the concept of the world that they experience. And so diegesis is a way, in a sense, of increasing and maintaining the noetic appreciation. But I think it's also important because it lends a sense of objectivity to the game world that makes a difference in how much meaning it seems to have, how much agency the players have. So,
yeah, I take this like as far as possible.
I knew this was the question for you, Richard.
Yeah,
Like this
yeah,
was just my little softball there. You're welcome.
yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So for the World Under Starlight, which is, I've made a lot of worlds and things like that, but the World Under Starlight is the setting that I put the most of my energies into over the last 2 decades, and it is, didn't even originally start as a tabletop game. It just started as like, uh, it was, I don't know, the fever dreams of a, you know, I don't know. It just started. It started out as basically, what Tolkien called his secret advice, and then eventually developed into something that I shared with my friends. But one of the things that I do is when I, the way I've described it sometimes as like liturgical world building, but the way that it works is that I might sit down and well, actually, people don't sit down and write histories, right? History happens first, and then they have, you have stories and legends and myths and popular, ballads and things like that, and eventually somebody comes along and writes a history. So when I first started world building, I started out just writing history, and then I became increasingly convinced. There's an early draft of Tolkien's famous essay on fairy stories, in which he says, this isn't in the final draft, but it is in some of the earlier drafts if you can get a hold of them. He says that the mind, the tongue, and the tail are coeval. That is, there and well, no, that's what he says in the final. That's what he says in the final version. But the original version of that sentence was simply, "There is no tail without the teller." And so this, for Tolkien, this is a fundamental idea for him, is that you should never actually be getting a story from the perspective of an omniscient third party. You should always be getting the story from the perspective of the people who wrote it down. And this is what he's doing, for instance, with the Silmarillion material, almost too successfully. People read the Silmarillion and they think, oh, this is an encyclopedia that will tell me everything I need to know about the origins of the various races of Middle-earth. But actually, it is not that. It is what the elves believe to be true. And those are maybe two different things. But so what I often do, taking inspiration from this, is start out by writing something. I'm a big form of long form narrative poetry, which is making a big comeback, by the way. People don't know this, but as John Matthews might know,
like I'm your friend and I love everything that you write, and I'm trying to incorporate that into my own world building, but I don't know that I can support that statement as a
hey,
fact.
listen, Marvel fatigue is a real thing, and as people get tired of Marvel movies, we're going back to long form narrative poetry.
Hey, I'm reading. My son and I just finished the Iliad. He's 11. We finished the Iliad. We're in the Odyssey.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
So I start out by writing a long form narrative poem, and then I usually just sit on it for a couple of years and then come back to it later. And then I don't try to rewrite it. I try to write a new one, as though I was using the original text as a source, right? And go back, and I do this, several times over the course of, sometimes many years. So this is one of the things that I really appreciated. This is why I loved By This Axe, is because there was so much of what you're calling diegesis. There's so much of this sort of feeling to things, and if I don't want to bring up things that should not be named, but there are certainly modern tabletop role-playing games out there that just really, when you have I'm thinking of some of the most recent 5e and like Pathfinder 2 products, right? And the way that they talk about races and racial history and things like this, that it's in a way that completely breaks for me, the experience of reading the book, which as the GM, I'm the person who's going to read the book the most. Right? The players will read the 10 pages that they actually care about. I'm the one who's going to be reading the book the most. And this is one of the things I really appreciate about your projects. So I guess the question that I'm warming up to in all of this is simply, if you wanted to encourage somebody who's writing a setting, or somebody who's writing working on a game of their own, to write in this way, what would you say to that person? Where would you begin?
That's great. So I know that what I have found valuable has been, I always imagine an author who is the character who is doing the writing. And I try and because I've been a GM for so many years, like I'm fairly good at getting into the role of a character and talking differently, etc. And so getting into the role of a character and then saying, how is this character going to tell this aspect of the game world? So for By This Axe, I invented this character of Circanius of Cipheron. And he was inspired by a combination of some of the smug law school professors that I met at law school, and as well as the writings of like the late 19th century, early 20th century Victorians, who took absolutely for granted their total cultural superiority, but they also tried to be really magnanimous towards their lessers, and how they wrote about them. And then also I added in a whiff of lack of self-awareness, and that combination made Circadius super fun to write, and it created an opportunity to weave an element of humor into the book that otherwise I think would have been absent if I had just gone for more. If I had started without building the character first, in other words. And I think Tolkien did the same. If I understand correctly, actually, he actually has a named author for all of the different variants of the Elven histories,
more
and
than
source
one
material.
actually.
Yeah. So you can honestly never go wrong by doing what Tolkien did. It just takes 20 years, and you have to, invent your own languages. And
we had somebody who said the Silmarillion is clearly Teleri propaganda.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
These Fëanorian sympathizers. They continue to plague me.
So Richard,
Fëanor did nothing wrong.
Fëanor did not. This is why we can't have nice things. Fëanor. Padre, who is a good friend of the show, is working. He's like, I need to finish my retelling of Noah's flood in Anglo-Saxon alliterative verse. Padre, we need to get you and Richard
technically the
connected.
Anglo-Saxons did that already, but I'm sure. I would love to see yours as well.
Yeah, that's actually your scholastic.
Yeah, I'm a Germanic philologist by academic training, and that's where most of my research is. And most of the research that I've been doing lately has had to do with actually the relationship between Anglo-Saxon literature, in particular the Beowulf poem, and also the homiletic tradition, and then what is sometimes called the biblical pseudo-epigrapha. This is stuff like the Book of Enoch and Jubilees and stuff like that. Stuff that actually the Anglo-Saxons were reading and had access to, and thought was really nifty.
Yeah.
So,
I'm going to send you, because it's that time of year, I need to send you I'm the very model of a biblical philologist. Yeah. Have you seen that, Alexander?
No, I haven't.
Somebody took I'm the very model of a modern major general and related it to biblical scholarship and philology. It is stupid, and I love it far more than I possibly should. It's not quite the guy who figured out that the Nemesis poem by H.P. Lovecraft can be set to Billy Joel's Piano Man. Like that's peak internet for me.
Right.
But this is like one step below that. So actually, you and I started chatting long ago about a series because I got into it specifically because you recommended it at the end of ACKS. I do not recommend this series to people, yet I have digested it multiple times. The Second Apocalypse series, which I would love. I mean, I owe you for getting me into this series. And I don't think your problem with it is the same problem that I think your problem with it, as when we talked about, was like 3 steps down. Like the initial problem with most people have with it is just the graphic violence and horrific sexual deprivations of the main antagonist race.
Yeah.
The second tier down is people didn't like the ending, but it's called The Second Apocalypse, so it's kind of like we kind of knew how like the ending was going to be. You did not like that journey for the last like book and a half.
It was more. I mean, are we going to do spoilers?
So this is going to be a spoiler of R. Scott Baker's Second Apocalypse, which I would say after Tolkien is possibly the most real secondary world. On a complete separate note, the other series that I love is, and Richard's going to roll his eyes at me, is the Thomas Covenant Chronicles.
Yeah.
And there used to, when you were talking about how the DMG affected your vocabulary, there used to be this great website called Stephen R. Donaldson Broke My Dictionary, because there's so many like French words and middle English words that he brings back into use. So it's the first series, The Prince of Nothing, which is why I said that guy should appreciate more, because if he named himself after the first trilogy, you gotta have an appreciation for the details, is a fantasy retelling of the First Crusade.
Right.
And really sort of if a modern person with a modern worldview was introduced to a fantasy world that has all of the ontological realities that we associate with a fantasy world, I think him going kind of crazy at the end makes sort of perfect sense. And then there's the aspect emperor quadrology that
I guess it's quadrology.
Yeah. What is it? The great ordeal of Anasarimber Catullus perished in fire and madness or something like that. It's the last line of the book.
Right.
So spoilers.
Yeah. So my criticism of the book is as follows. If you are familiar with R. Scott Baker's philosophy, his philosophical worldview is, I would say, diametrically opposed to my own. Mm-hmm. He does not believe that humans have free will.
Yep.
He does not believe that humans actually have consciousness. He has a whole blog about how our paltry 3-pound brains can't really comprehend anything. And that I believe the term he uses is he's the first post-semantic philosopher.
Yes, his article, "The Semantic Apocalypse," is very
semantic apocalypse. Yeah. And essentially that there's no meaning to anything.
Yeah.
And so what I disliked about the series is that at the very end, he goes out of his way to render everything that came before in the series meaningless.
Yep.
And he did it on purpose. He went on Reddit and said he did it on purpose. And he said he wanted to do that to make people feel a sense of despair of the semantic apocalypse.
Yeah.
And to me, that's genuinely evil. Actually.
Yeah, no, I'm not debating your take on the.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that's evil, right? Like I subscribe to, what Ayn Rand said, that art should show the world as it could be and should be.
Mm-hmm.
And he, lavished an enormous amount of time and got us very, very invested in order to convince us that everything is meaningless and we should feel horrible. And I just don't support that. And that was not evident in the first trilogy. Like at the end of the first trilogy, there's this amazing line where Kellis's father tells him, you're gonna, you're Dunyain just like me, so you're gonna come to the same conclusion. And Kellis says, no, I'm something more.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. And I just was like, where did that author go? Right? Because this was the buildup.
Well, if you've read some of his scholastic stuff where he's talking about this, he started the series as what he calls himself a philosophical exceptionalist, that humanity is unique and exceptional on Earth. And sometime between the first trilogy and the second trilogy, he became what he calls a philosophical mediocritist, where he's like, there's nothing special about humanity. And it's like, that's why like the first trilogy, so he's like, I had to keep fighting my old way of thinking, my new way of thinking, because I didn't want to like reveal it until I got to the end, because it's so diametrically opposed to where he was at when he wrote the first series.
So that makes so much sense because the same thing happened with Ursula K. Le Guin. If you read her first 2 books, and then she has a major philosophical change, and then all of the later books are totally different.
Yeah.
So I recommend books 1 and books 2 of Earthsea, and I don't recommend the latter. And so now I feel like I can comfortably recommend the first 3 books of Prince of Nothing again, and then say that I'll just say that the other 4 were written by a different author.
They were, which is unfortunate because I think Killages in the Judging Eye, the descent through the non-man
Yeah.
mansion is perhaps the greatest homage to Tolkien's Moria
Yep.
that has ever
Yep.
been written. But
Yep.
it's a completely different author.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I know it
Horrible.
inspired how you looked at magic in ACKS.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Because he's one of the only people I think in all of fantasy writing who takes military history really seriously, takes into account things like logistics, the maneuvering of armies, and he's able to have these great pitched battles, but also have um, magic users. And they're not just these paltry, weak magic users, or the sort of like subtle off-scene Conan type sorcerers. I mean, these guys are flying above the battlefield, nuking people,
Yeah.
but he makes it work. And that was really inspirational to me. And I said, this is the way the battles are in the Prince of Nothing series. That's how I want the battles to be. So yeah, I mean, so I still really think he's one of the best writers around for that kind of thing. I was so heartbroken by it's the only book I've ever given in my entire life a 1-star Amazon review to.
I loved you said that the last book was so awful that it emitted a tachyon burst that went back through time and retroactively made you hate the entire series.
Yes, that was my review.
Now, have you read Malazan Books of the Fallen? Because he is another guy who focuses on the military aspect of fantasy. And
so I have tried several times. I've made it through 3 or 4 of the books, and every time I just give up because I feel like he's playing hide the ball. And I'm just like, bro, just spend one sentence telling me some clue of what's going on. And he never does. And it just frustrates me. Some writers love that sort of show don't tell approach to the point where I feel like they're just hiding the ball and I feel manipulated as the reader.
That first book is really hard for that reason, because he's like, I'm never going to have 2 characters in a scene explain anything that
ever.
they would know about. Like,
right.
We're not talking about, like, if we started talking about Twitch, we would not explain Twitch. We would just throw the word we're streaming on Twitch with no context whatsoever.
No context. Yeah. Exactly. And, and I get it. And it's like, it's a very effective way of writing, I think, when used at the right amount, but the amount he uses is too much for me. So I will eventually go back and read the series, but I think when I do, I'm going to do it with like an iPad and a wiki in front of me. And so, if I come on this, I'm just like, what the hell is this? Because I don't find it pleasurable.
I have all of the books in one e-file. And every time I do a read through and I'm on another read through, I'm like annotating my own copy so that I'm like, this references something that's going to come up there. But his military stuff, and then I'm actually dedicating to the entirety of December on my show Behind the Screen. We're going to talk about the Malazan series and how gaming. Your gaming can be influenced by it and how it started off as a game. And several of the actual stories are actually from his home game. But also for a guy to dedicate, no spoilers, this is just the scope of the 10 books is that compassion is what makes us human. And to have a military fantasy writer who is just writing, to steal from Baker, the slog of slogs, in some of these, the Chain of Dogs, which is in book 2, which is just this horrible, gut-wrenching military campaign.
Yeah.
To still have compassion be the defining trait that makes people human is exceptional to me. So when you ever finish it, if you ever want to have somebody to chat with, or even just...
all right. You know what? You've inspired me to go back and reread it, because part of my hesitation was the sense that I was going to get to the end and be R. Scott Bakered again.
No.
So
no, the ending is immensely satisfying, and also it doesn't wrap up every thread because his best friend is also writing stories. So there are some threads that he punted to him, and some threads that he's answering in other things. But the main theme of power drawing power and compassion being the core of what makes us human has a very satisfying resolution at the end. If you're reading it, and I am So a friend and fellow game designer, Rob Hainso, who is doing 13th Age, he's reading through them right now. So I will get discords and texts from him going, why is this important? And I'll be like, what level of spoiler do you want? So if you ever want to reach out about Malazan, know that I am so more than willing to discuss Malazan at the drop of a hat, anyone's hat.
Oh, that's awesome.
Like that is
that's awesome.
Well, I think I only had one more question on my outline.
Okay.
Richard, do you have any thoughts before we jump into this last one? Anything
Go
you want
for
to
it.
add? Okay.
Go for
So, and this is entirely at a depth of detail that you are willing to share.
Okay. Okay.
But I know that when I was writing Jackals, Jackals and the way the world of Calypsis developed and the underlying principles of the game and how things played out was heavily influenced by I was going through my master's of theology at the time in biblical languages and biblical cultures, and comparative mythologies of, we had the Baal cycle, how these things were being reflected in like the prophets. And so like I had this deeply influenced my my journey in writing Jackals, and then also my thanks to my friendship with Richard and a really great professor I had, kind of an exploration of what I would call more traditional Christianity, Catholicism, Orthodoxy, the early church fathers, these kind of things. This really changed the way I looked at my game and how I was designing it. And I know in one of your interviews, you made the comment, when I was an atheist materialist, I thought this way, and I don't think this way about the game anymore because I'm no longer an atheist materialist. And you talked about how you were diametrically opposed to Baker's very bleak that there is no movement of our soul. There is just, the dominoes that fall in the pre-described manner based off how the dominoes were placed before. And
right.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you want to share kind of where your journey is at on
sure.
that and how it's affected the development of ACKS 2?
Yeah. So when I started my RN Empire campaign back in 2008, I had just gotten married, and it was the 2008 recession had just crushed my hopes and dreams of selling The Escapist. We had had a deal lined up to sell it to Condé Nast, and the deal fell apart because of the 2008 Great Recession. And so we headed into several years of severe fiscal hardship as we tried to find a buyer for The Escapist. At the same time, my wife began to become very, very ill with myalgic encephalomyelitis. And so the setting of the RN Empire, which is a setting of an empire collapsing, is very indicative of where my head was at the time, because it felt like everything was literally falling apart in my world. And that the successes I had to date in life were on the decline, and very much the concept was one of what Tolkien called Northern heroism, that you should accept that everything is going to go to absolute hell, and nevertheless you struggle on anyway, because that's Northern courage. And at the time that I wrote it, I didn't really accept Tolkien's concept of the eucatastrophe, that the Northern courage could be validated by the glorious but unexpected salvation at the end.
Yeah.
And I didn't really, I knew that he had said it, but I didn't really understand it. Over the next couple of years, a couple interesting things happened, which is one, I learned that my wife had had two very profound out-of-body experiences that made her believe that there was much more than what we think there is. And also a good friend of mine, an author named John C. Wright, had a very powerful spiritual experience as well, that brought him from being an atheist to being a Christian. And it began to make me think, well, either these people that I know and love are crazy, or something's wrong with my worldview, that I can't incorporate what their lived experiences. And it led me on this path of really starting to read a lot of the I would call it like the Christian criticism of contemporary materialism and contemporary scientism. And I did a very broad amount of reading in that, ranging from alternative views to quantum physics to Ed Feser's views, Aristotelian views on science, et cetera, et cetera. And it changed how I viewed the world and made me a bit more optimistic and more hopeful on a spiritual level, if not necessarily on a material level. On a material level, I think I'm still pretty pessimistic about where we're heading and how things are going. And so I think where that's apparent in the game design is that in the early versions of the Aran Empire setting, I had a very, very robust mythology for the Zaharans that was really dark, where when you died, your soul disintegrated. And so the only way you could, stick around was to become undead. And I didn't really have a fully fleshed out cosmology for the Arans. It's just like, oh, when you die, you reincarnate. Like I didn't put a lot more. And then sort of my religious readings really led me to develop a full-fledged theology for them that's much more hopeful and is somewhat inspired by Plutarch,
Okay.
I would say. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that was kind of my journey.
No, I mean, I'm heartened to hear that you have a much more, optimistic view on that thing. So you had mentioned it a couple of times in the interview, and I was
Yeah.
like, well, you know what, I know my life was, my game design is informed by the stuff going on in my life and where I'm at in my journey and my walk, and so I figured I would ask you the same thing.
Yeah, I became an atheist when my father died. I was 20 years old and he got struck down by cancer, and I just couldn't accept the existence of that level of evil and square it with the belief in a benevolent God. And so I rejected it instead, and I became a believer in a very cold Darwinian nihilistic universe. And I still tried, nevertheless, to be an achiever in that world and a good person, but it was more from a like almost a Nietzschean or a Northern Courage worldview. And definitely like that even shows up in the games I played back then. Like my go-to game for many years was Cyberpunk 2020, which is about the most nihilistic game you can possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And and my friends used to joke that my motto was "It just doesn't matter," and right, so
It's the third form of matter, right? There's matter, antimatter, and then
it just
matter.
doesn't matter. Yeah, exactly. So it definitely was a big change for me in my worldview. And I think honestly, it's made me a much better game designer and world builder because spirituality and the sense that there's more to life than just this material world has been central to every civilization up until ours, basically.
Yeah.
And you can't really understand what motivated a crusader to go on the first crusade if you think, well, he couldn't really have believed in all that God nonsense. So he must have done it to get castles in the Middle East or something, right? It just, none of history makes sense unless you can put yourself in that mentality. And so it's, I think, enabled me to have a much deeper understanding of the source material that I work from.
Well, first of all, Castles and Crusades would make a great name for a game if
it hadn't already.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody was listening or retroactively wanted to apply that. But yes, I mean that's the thing. Richard and I we'll have conversations and we'll watch people say something, whether it's about D&D or history, and it's like, or we could take what people wrote at face value and understand that they believed the things they wrote, right? One of my favorite things in talking, like when I'm teaching a class, is the fact that on whether it's on biblical symbolism or diving into a book of the Bible, is the fact that, like, listen, but after the Enlightenment, the question we really ask of history is how does it work? It's what the question we ask about our world, how does it work? Which is great for taking a phone apart and putting it back together, or creating a Gnostic computer program that allows us to digitally be in the same space while being remote, like what we're doing now.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But before the Enlightenment, no one asked that question. They asked the question, how is it true? Like, what is the truth of the story? Right. So trying to apply the modern, how does it work lens to scriptures or myths or stories or histories, it doesn't work. It always breaks down.
Yeah.
And, the modern view of history is not the way Plutarch or Herodotus were writing histories. It
Right.
just,
It's not.
it's incompatible.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is something most of my work, especially the things that I'm mildly famous for online, is around is helping people learn how to read traditional stories as though they have meaning, as though the people who wrote them believed that what they were writing was in some way true. And yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is if you take the Enlightenment to its logical conclusion, you end up at R. Scott Baker.
Yeah. Nihilism
yeah.
being kind of the only. So
Yeah.
I'm
And-
keeping it together because we have a friend, Christopher, who is so steeped in Warhammer lore that if you mention greenskins, he spits kind of reflexively because he's a dwarf player, and that's the way it is.
Right. Yeah.
I typically do that when someone mentions the Enlightenment, so I'm trying not to like expectorate
spit.
on stream.
Oh no. So I used to be consider myself, a classical liberal, Enlightenment liberal. And I read this book by Stephen Hicks, Professor Stephen Hicks, called Explaining Postmodernism. And in it, he explains how postmodernism arises, and he does it from a classical liberal perspective. But he makes the point that the classical liberals lost because they were never able to actually defend reason on the basis of just reason, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't prove logic with logic.
Yeah.
And that entire enterprise of the logical positivists failed. All of those efforts failed. And so I thought to myself, well, is the answer then just nihilism? I'm just a meat robot. There's nothing. And that's led me to read a lot more ancient philosophy because they have an entirely viable alternative of how things work that makes, more sense. And I kind of think we made a terrible mistake in abandoning a lot of those concepts, but we're living in the aftermath of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, any final thoughts or questions you wanted to ask Alexander while we have him here?
What changes did you make to Magic Missile in ACKS 2?
Great question. So the new spell is called Mage Missile. And what it is, it's a concentration duration spell that allows the mage to hurl a magical arrow that does 1d4 and hits automatically every round. And so it's really nice because you can maintain concentration when moving at exploration speed. So here's your first level mage. He only gets one spell per day, but he casts his Mage Missile. And now, as long as he doesn't get hit and lose concentration, he can keep flinging magical darts at his enemies every round.
That's awesome.
I think my players are going to really like that.
Yeah. And so that was so now, because a lot of people said, well, I like the fact that the wizard could do the tactical nuke slumbered once a day to win the encounter, but I wish there was an alternative for a wizard who wants to do something every round.
Yeah.
And so now there is. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. And that spell has been proven really, really popular with the playtest players. They saved themselves from a demon by using that spell last time I ran, because it was, demon was immune to ordinary weapons, but they had the mage with Mage Missile and they're just like shield walling him and he's going ping, ping.
I can see it in my head as soon as you said it. That's how the players would react. Like, we must protect our artillery piece.
Yep. So that's the new Magic Missile.
So the real reason that I asked that is because my final question was something along the lines of unshackled from having to stick to the OGL and just try to please the let's say, like, and I don't mean this at all in a pejorative sense, but like just trying to please the nostalgia folks, like, right? How do you feel like this really changed the design of the game, but Magic in particular? Like, let's say Magic and Monsters.
Yeah, I'm not really trying to appeal to the nostalgia crowd at this point. I think there's a lot of other products that really do that really well. And it's a tough space to be in. If someone wants to play something that makes them nostalgic for BX, they have so many options. So I'm not, so that was no longer a criterion. Instead, the criteria for me was game balance, both at the adventurer tier, but also at the higher tiers of play. Like, what sort of spells should be in the game to create the sort of world that I want to exist in the game. So like, here's an example of one change is that in the original BX and in ACKS, the commune spell, you got to ask the GM 3 yes or no questions. You were talking directly to God and they were always correct. And that could be really hard to have any sort of mysteries in the game world. Like, is the Emperor secretly worshiping chaos? Yes. Okay, guys, the Emperor
Dang
secretly
it.
worshiping chaos. Let's go
Let's
kill him.
just take care of it.
So the new communion now says, actually, you can't directly talk to your god. That would blow your brain away. Instead, you talk to an angel or a saint or an exalted hero. And he is not necessarily infallible or omniscient, and his knowledge can be checked in the same way that, for instance, I believe it's in Daniel in the Bible, like how one of the angels talks about, like, hey, sorry, I'm delayed. I was delayed on the way because I had to fight with some other counter, demons.
The Prince of Persia, and I couldn't deal with it, and so until
I couldn't
Michael
deal with
showed
it
up.
until Michael showed up. Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of the inspiration for the new communion. So now you're like the angel, you ask, hey, is the emperor worshiping chaos? And and he says, I'm not sure someone powerful is protecting information about the emperor.
Yeah.
Nice.
Love it.
Yeah. So that's like one example of how I've gone back and kind of killed some sacred cows in order to make what I think is a better gameplay. Likewise, got rid of find traps, got rid of knock, got rid of detect secret doors. None of those spells exist anymore. Yeah.
Excellent. Any monsters that you were like, well, I'm gonna drop these to the curb, or new monsters that you were like, these fit so much better in the RN Empire, let me add these in because I'm not necessarily as constrained with replicating a previous bestiary.
Yeah, so for the monsters, I went back and took a look at a lot of the ancient bestiaries, and like monsters that Pliny wrote about and things like that. And so the basilisks, the catablepas, however that's pronounced. I've got the stymphalian birds, strix instead of sturges.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of been taken back to its most ancient roots. And sometimes I had a lot of fun with it. So, like, for instance, you have this notion of the gorgons, which in the original literature were, these tusked wing. There were 3 of them. They turned you to stone. But then you get this later evolution of the concept of the Medusa, who's a woman who just has snakes for hair, right? But she's otherwise a woman. And so I put both in. And so the idea is that they're different stages of a life cycle. So a gorgon mates with a human being, typically a blind man, and then produces a child who's a Medusa. And then when the Medusa reaches maximum age, she metamorphoses into a gorgon and continues the process, right?
This is so terrible, and I hate it, and I can't wait to use it on people.
Yeah. And so I had a ton of fun doing that kind of thing, figuring out, or like another really great example is how all the fairies work, because the question is, well, okay, well, how does a sprite and a pixie and all of these creatures fit in with an elf, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's always been kind of an interesting question. And so, like, I came up with this idea that pixies reproduce by breathing life into elven infants who've died of illness or infection. And so when an elven child dies, it's a tragedy, but if the child's body vanishes soon thereafter, the parents can stop grieving, knowing their child will live on as a pixie. The children remember their old life dimly as if a dream, which fades with time, right?
That's kind of cool.
And then Spriggans do not have women or children of any sort. They reproduce by stealing the young children of goblins, gnomes, dwarves, halflings, or humans, turning them into their own kind in magical rituals performed in places of power on unholy days. And so now I've tapped into those old ancient legends of fairies as stealing children, right? But there's good reason now for it, because that genuinely is how they reproduce. But I've axified it, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to say, folks, if you play ACKS, there's a better than 0 chance that at least one of your PCs will be blinded completely in the course of adventuring, which opens them up to sire a whole family of Medusa. These are real opportunities out there, even for blind PCs.
That's right. We also included the rules for how much you need to feed your green slime in order to grow it and create more green slime. So you can now
this is gonna just go so bad.
My favorite ACKS Mortal Wounds table. Was it Mortal Wound? Yeah, I think it was the Mortal Wounds table. Was the thief who lost both of their arms in a single encounter with an ogre, and we established that basically the ogre had like when it looked like the ogre had kicked the thief away, he was actually holding on to both of the thief's arms. And
Right.
I mean, she survived and immediately retired upon returning to.
Yep.
Oh boy.
So, well,
Yep.
Alexander, thank you so much for joining us on this. This has been just a great discussion. Congratulations on
Thank
the
you.
the ACKS Kickstarter. It is going on right now, folks. I'm going to put the link back in the chat. He is rolling up more and closer to 300,000, which is just a great number.
Woo!
Yes, John, she was out of the army at that point. It was the ogre performed a disarm maneuver, and it was wildly successful.
You never go full Grendel.
You never go full Grendel. And I mean, I feel like that's kind of a perfect place for us to end on. You know, we'll make a little meme of that. Never go full Grendel. And but yes, Alexander, thanks for coming on, talking about ACKS, and just sharing some history of this game that I know is going to grace both of our tables for many years to come in the future.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the chance to have a good chat.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this episode of Beyond the Table. There are more in the pipeline. We will be letting people know as those come up. And then you can join us every Tuesday and Thursday, typically at 10 a.m. Central on this Twitch channel for Behind the Screen, a show where we just talk about games that are interesting and beautiful and why we should be, you know, seeking after that in our gaming experience. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. We'll see you all later. Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.